Welcome to this first lecture on the classical aesthetics, the constancy of form. It's quite interesting to consider that in ceramics certain forms have been made for thousands of years, and the forms can be categorized into two groups. You can have Greek forms, which tends to be an assembly of disparate shapes. And among those forms, it may be important to remember two of them, which is the amphora on the upper left side, and right underneath it, the calyx crater, because both those two forms are still made currently today, and the name for them are still in use. And the calyx form at the very bottom left is also one of those forms that could be found in the world now. But all the others you don't really have to worry too much about unless you become very interested in Greek pottery. Now the other group of forms in the classical aesthetics are Asian pottery shapes, and those tend to be characterized as a continuous line of profile, and this gives them a very beautiful elegance and elevation. So there is quite a bit of difference between Greek classical forms and Asian pottery shapes of the classical vocabulary. So just as a brief introduction, I will talk about black figure pottery. And black figure pottery is characterized with silhouettes of black figures over a lighter ground, as we see, and then this was developed later on by Antiquity around 500 BC with the red figure style, which is light figures over a dark ground. So if you are curious about this type of ceramics, you may want to go online and look into the history chapters of the Art of the Future, and there will be much more information about that type of wares. Now, it is interesting to consider bilingual vases that combine on one side black figure and on the other side red figure representations. And again, this was invented by Andokidas, a potter and maker of Greek pottery around 500 BCE. And what's interesting about that difference between black figure and red figure is that they present a pictorial experience that's quite different. With black figure, the figure is a silhouette, it's quite flat, and the ground on which it stands has depth, while with red figure, the figure has much more volume and much more credibility in space, but it stands against a dark, flat ground that has no depth. And this has been quite influential in the development of pottery surfaces, and you see an examples of that by Pablo Picasso, where he uses both black figure and then red figure together on the same work. Now, to speak very briefly about red figure pieces, again, this is a very, very brief introduction to a rather complex subject. The work of the Berlin painter is quite interesting because he situates his figures within the space of the vessel, and the vessel itself becomes the ground on which the figure is experienced. And I'm just showing you a few more examples of those extraordinary work from Greek antique pottery. And I won't say much more about those, but you can find out again in the history sections of the Art of the Future available online. So what's interesting as well is not just at the level of form, as I've mentioned already, but at the level of surface. There is something as a classical surface in ceramics. And what's interesting to know is that when those objects were made and painted, they look like the object on the left. And it's only in the firing that they acquired the visual quality that we see on the right on this pellique. This is clearly explained in the history section of the Art of the Future, and I won't go into more details about it here, but there are also books about the technique of Attic pottery making, and you may want to consult those if you are more curious. So this characteristic of dark on light, light on dark is found all over the history of ceramics. This is an example from China here too, wonderful example, a dark on light on the left and a light on dark on the right. And this has been tremendously influential, and we see examples of that today, like in this vase by Paul Soldner from the 1970s, where you have on the same object light on dark and dark on light, as you do as well in a much more abstract manner in those 4 cups by Chris Staley. So it may be interesting to understand the working of those differences to create work today of great sensibility and great efficiency. We will be talking about Richard Millet in many of those lectures because he is a person who has explored the connections of contemporary ceramics to historical precedents, both at the level of form and surface, in very interesting ways. So again, those are 2 examples here where he works with black on red and red on black on his work, and makes you aware of the differences between the 2 and how they operate quite differently. And yet another example of this very complex and sophisticated exploration of those potentials for surface and form, object and image, 2D and 3D to come together in ceramics. And then other examples here going back from Cyprus 2000 BC and reinterpreted in the 1950s by French ceramic artist Suzanne Ramien, who was the teacher of Picasso when he started to do ceramics in the mid-1940s. And so you have here the transitions from a very ancient object reinterpreted in modern times, and then again by one of the great masters of 20th century modernism. So there are a lot of other classical traditions. Classical traditions are found all over the world. They're not specifically Greek or Asian. They are found throughout time, throughout history, throughout geography, and all over the surface of the globe. Those are 2 wonderful examples from prehistoric time in China. This is the very beginning of thrown pottery, thrown on the wheel. It's thrown very, very thinly. It has a monochrome surface that's on glaze. Those tend to be characteristic of classical forms and surfaces as well. And what's interesting about those objects is that if I told you they were made last week and they were contemporary work, you'd believe me, although they are thousands of years old. And 2 more examples here from the beginning of the 20th century. This vase by Michael Powolny, based on mathematical principles and an approach to minimalism, both at the level of form and at the level of surface, that will not be seen again before minimalism in the late 50s, early 60s. And another deconstruction and abstraction of a classical form by Jean and Sophie Tauber-Arp. So pre-Columbian cultures like the Nazca cultures of Peru and many other pre-Columbian cultures also have their own classical tradition. And again, those were tremendously influential, and a designer like Christopher Dresser, working in 1880 in England, was greatly influenced by those types of wares. The work of First Nation cultures from North America, the Iroquois and many others, have been reinterpreted as well by many makers all the way to today, Daisy Youngblood being one of them. So I'll be introducing you to a lot of material here that I don't go very deeply into, like the work of Nampeyo, who was a Navajo potter working at the beginning of the 20th century. But now that you know about Nampeyo and you know what her work looks like, you may want to research it further for your own needs and interests. So let's go a bit more deeply into the Asian classical aesthetics, because it's a very important one as well. And you have here on the right a Korean Celadon mapping, and you can see the continuous line of profile that's very gracious and very elegant. And you have here on the left, in the work of Susan Wolf, the combination of both traditions of classical form making in ceramics. The interior of this object is a Greek amphora shape, and the exterior of the object is an Asian Maiping shape. So she has combined in a very complex and sophisticated way both the Greek and the Asian classical aesthetics at the level of form, and that's quite extraordinary work in many ways. So you can see here from this Kangxi vessel on the right that potters working today are still influenced by those types of forms. They still use them to make references to history, to traditions, to cultures, to political events sometimes, and so on. And the surfaces may be very classical and very familiar, but they've been reinterpreted in a much more looser way. And then they often combine decorative elements with other representations that are much more confrontational and possibly difficult. One thing that we got from the Asian classical aesthetic as well is the concept of the garniture, which is a grouping of multiple objects that form a unit. Here we have 5 of them. They were made in China in the Kangxi period, and they're now in a museum in Dresden, Germany. And when the Europeans saw those types of objects when they first came to Europe, it was greatly influential in the development of European ceramics. We have an example here from Delft in Holland from the 17th century. And then it is still tremendously influential for various development in contemporary ceramics as well, both in Asia, like this is an example by Lu Bian from China, where he makes objects that disintegrate and fall apart and decompose over time to speak about, the passage of time, the impermanency of things versus the permanency of ceramics. And it creates a psychological response on our part that's quite powerful. 2 more examples by Lu Bian again, and just to show you how people are reinterpreted a very ancient form that's very classical and use that system and that model to create work that speak of contemporary society and the anxieties we have around certain experiences and the fragility of things. An example, Front and Back by Joe Pinkelman, an American ceramic artist, speaking about nuclear energy and deformations caused by those types of things. So by using a very familiar, traditional, sort of innocent format that has deep historical roots and combining it with decorative elements and then images of great shocking value, the contrast is very potent. This is an example of my own work here, where you have on one side a day scene of a nude with a still life of fruit on a tabletop, and on the other side the same scene at night. So those kinds of groupings of objects permit that kind of visual richness and complexity. And another example here by Janet de Boos from Australia, which again makes you aware of that extraordinary dynamism between form and surface and how the two can come together in an extremely exciting way. And by putting images of vessels and pots on an actual pot, the conflations between 2D and 3D and image and objects becomes extremely dynamic. So many artists use this concept of making groups of vessels for various ways. Again, I will not go very deeply into all of these work, just make you aware of those people, Roberto Lugo and others, as we've seen previously, and what happens when instead of making a unique object, you make a pair, a group of 3 or a group of 5, and present them as a cohesive unit. And all kinds of strategies around presentation and installation and display can be used to emphasize and use the full potential of that grouping. And I'm very sorry for the paucity of the image here by Walter Ostrom, but that's all I could find online. And what's interesting about this big turtle is that it sports on its back both examples of Greek traditional classical forms and Asian classical forms as well, to show you that in ceramics those two major traditions come together and are very much part of the vocabulary of ceramics all the way to today. So this is a section on the new classicism, because by the middle of the 18th century, there was a revival through archaeological discoveries in Italy and elsewhere for Greek Attic pottery again. And Josiah Wedgwood, the great industrialist potter, at the first day of his factory on the 13th of June 1769, threw those pots that were then painted in the red figure style. And there was a revival of those types of things. And this is something, this new classicism is something that's going on all the way to today in the work of Rosalind de Lille, in works that exaggerates and complexifies and changes things, but makes more clear references to bodies and human forms and so on. And the same in the work of James Turrell, reworking the black basalt ware that were first invented by Josiah Wedgwood in a contemporary idiom. Or again, Daniel Listwan making those types of very classical forms, but speaking about nuclear energy and pollution and the danger of contemporary society. So this is three very interesting examples based on the Portland vase. The Portland vase itself is a glass original that we see on the right. In the middle, there is a reworking of it in ceramic by Josiah Wedgwood towards the end of the 18th century. And on the very left, Michael Eden doing a 3D print of a Portland vase as well. So you can see that an object that's 2,000 years old in glass on the right has been reinterpreted on the left through the influence of Josiah Wedgwood in the 18th century in a very contemporary way by using digital technology and digital printing. It is quite interesting to see how all those traditions and aesthetics come together as well. So you have Yixing teapots from China made in the 18th century that come to Europe and then influence the development of European ceramics greatly, as we see in this basaltware teapot or coffee pot by Wedgwood. And here a very contemporary example by Linda Sikora, who is clearly informed and influenced by this 18th century example still from Yixing, China. So those kinds of exchanges and conversations between different times, different cultures, different parts of the world are still very much going on today. And you can see this exploration happening here in the work of Julian Stair. So let's talk about the classical aesthetics now further. So all kind of artists are making ceramics these days. They may be ceramicists themselves, they may be potters, they may be artists working in other fields. Thomas Scoot is known mostly as a sculptor, but he does quite a bit of ceramics quite regularly. And what's interesting about those forms is that they are double symmetry, closed stack forms. So the symmetry is from left to right and from top to bottom. And that's quite something unusual and quite rare in ceramic vocabulary of form in itself. So the people reinterpret those classical shapes in all kinds of ways, and sometimes with very surprising material. This work is all made with soap. Yes, soap. So it's quite interesting that this artist working in a completely different material from ceramics makes ceramic-like objects that are referencing, in her case, the classical aesthetics of Asia, but with a new material altogether. And there are quite a few other artists working in the very recent past all the way to today who again reinterpret ceramic forms and ceramic traditions and ceramic aesthetics using other material like flat paper cutouts mounted on boards, or again making those types of objects. Here we have amphora shapes from the Greek classical aesthetic vocabulary of forms, all made with recycled plastic. So it seems very interesting to me that not only within the field of ceramic itself, but in other art making practices, people use those forms. Here we have examples of a mixture of Greek classical aesthetics with Asian classical aesthetics reinterpreted through a very personal contemporary sensibility, but made with papier-mâché. Or those examples here with laser cut paper. So because people are still using those forms and make those references in their work now, it is quite important to understand the differences between those aesthetics and the differences between the Greek vocabulary of forms versus the Asian vocabulary of forms, and see what happens when they are used in a very contemporary context. And one of the artists who has been working with more depth and complexity with those issues is Ai Weiwei, again painting various patterns and doing all kinds of various things with antiquities. Now, one of the earliest ceramic artists who has explored in the 20th century, starting in the late 60s, early 70s, is Michael Fremkes. And here you have two examples of his work, one from the Asian classical aesthetic on the left and one from the Greek classical aesthetics on the right. And he has reworked those forms to comment about the nature of ceramics, the nature of contemporary society, and how we can make objects today that connect with the past but speak of the present and project themselves into the future in very exciting ways. And the work of Michael Fremkes, he was the first that I know to do that with that degree of commitment at that time. And this was work of tremendous influence for the development of ceramics all the way to now. And we have example here by Gary Steinborn, who was a student of Michael Fremkes, and how he has continued the exploration of this great potential for those types of objects to speak to us in new and original ways. And even somebody like Andrea Gill on the right, making an object that's like the like of which you've never seen, that's a completely new form, although quite symmetrical, by inserting the silhouette of an Asian classical aesthetic shape within the context of that vessel, but using the red and the black of the Greek classical aesthetics at the level of surface, combines those two traditions and ways of making with great sensibility and potency. Another example here by Stephen Friedman, on the left an Asian form, on the right a Greek shape. They have been deconstructed. They're now covered with signs and symbols and texts and languages to, again, connect with contemporary culture and society in ways that are meaningful. And, of course, the extraordinary work of Grayson Perry from England, again, an example of a Greek form on the left, created by combining various disparate shapes and assembling them together, while the Asian form on the right is more of the continuation of a curved line as the profile of the piece. So other classical aesthetics, again, coming from pre-Columbian America, we have throughout the 20th century the work of Maria Martinez and Julian from San Ildefonso in the United States, and two more recent examples by two Pueblo artists coming from that same part of the world. So you can see that those traditions are not stifling, that people are reinventing them, reinterpreting them, making them very personal, making them much, much more contemporary in some ways through sometimes simplification, sometimes complexification. It varies. You have here an example where the work has been made more complex by exaggeration, by assembly of various forms that are not quite coming together in convincing ways, and this disjunction creates again the energy and the dynamic experience that the work provides. And of course you can have very standard forms that are very ordinary and banal with very graphic and confrontational subject matter of a real contemporary significations. And we'll continue to speak about those aspects when we looked into the narrative aesthetics later on and the decorative aesthetics as well. But it serves as an introduction here for this type of work where people look at history and reinterpret it and change it and make it current and make it original, make it personal in the contemporary world. And we have example of that. And sometimes the people like Magdalena Odundo look at their own ethnic and cultural background to create new work, and sometimes they look at other cultures. Ceramics is a very varied field, and it's been made throughout history, throughout geography, all over the globe. And people feel very at ease with looking at the work of other cultures and reinterpret it for their own need, without the need for it to be appropriation necessarily. It's just more of a celebration and an acknowledgement of the contribution those historical cultures have brought to the vocabulary of ceramic and pottery as artistic fields. Here, working in Vancouver, Laura Leach, again reinterpreting those types of aesthetics based here on organic shapes, which are at the source for a lot of those forms. And an artist from Montreal, Laurent Crass, looking again at Greek Attic pottery, but changing it dramatically, making it speak of other issues around sexuality, around relationships, and sometimes simply copying historical shape with very little change and transformations, but adding onto them modern historical events as graphic and as graphic surfaces to create again contrast and a shocking conflation of the two. And the desecration of history by attacking those forms, destroying them, being quite sacrilegious towards those shapes, which create a tremendous amount of pressure to conform and to do as well and to emulate. I'm guessing that this maker is trying to free himself from those forms by attacking them in such a dramatic and violent way. While somebody like Leopold Fulham again uses those forms to destabilize your relationship to them by creating an object that combines aspect of Precolumbian stirrup vessels from Precolumbian time with surfaces from the Rococo period, and making Santa Claus into a stirrup vessel and putting together things that are not meant to be together and see what happens when you conflate them in such a fashion. And making references that have been made for thousands of years. The form on the left is a volute crater from Greek Attic pottery vocabulary of forms, reworked in France in porcelain. So it's a different size, it's a different material, it has a completely different kind of surface on it, but it still references an object that comes from a culture that's almost 3,000 years old. And then Leopold Fulham reinterprets it further through abstraction, through simplifications, and again, making you aware of the relationship of surface to form, the nature of decorations, the symbolic nature of it sometimes, which are all things we will be looking into when we looked into the decorative aesthetics. So there are many, many artists throughout the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, the 20th century, all the way to today, who reinvestigate and look into this amazing potential for classical forms to create new experience and make new work. And I will be showing you quite a few examples of that here, where people use classical shapes with contemporary surfaces to comment on various aspects of contemporary society, making work combining ceramic with metal, with plaster, with other material, something like combining it with plastic found objects, with ceramic made parts, and putting them together there is a tremendous amount of that kind of work being made now in all kinds of ways. So again, it's quite interesting to consider why is it that those artists are using such ancient shapes and ancient references, whether they come from the Greek repertory of form or the Asian one, with surfaces that are informed by contemporary aspects of our lives now. And people can use those forms to speak of all kinds of things, all kinds of relationships, all kinds of psychological states, and it's a great ground for because of the familiarity of the form and the connections that we make with their origins and their source. It creates an instant recognition and a sense of ease and familiarity that is then disrupted by the surfaces and the images that are added on. And I think this is often the reason why people will use those forms again and again and again all the way to now. Like Itomi Osono on the right, this is the Portland vase. Again, it's the very form that comes from Roman glass, reinterpreted by Wedgwood, and then used again and again by so many other people. And of course, things like computer technology, pixelization, and so on also come into play into this type of work. And people use computer technology like water jet cutting, again with the Portland vase as a basic shape, to create a work that could only have been made today, that could not have been produced in such a complexity of form at any other time in history, yet the form itself is quite ancient. And there are many, many, many more examples of this type of approach to classical form, whether it is Asian or Greek or from any other culture, as a matter of fact, like pre-Columbian America or Africa, and so on and so forth. But it is quite fascinating to me to consider how new technologies and new processes, new material, new tools can be used to create forms that are at the same time referencing very ancient forms and speak of contemporary society, the world in which we live now, the access we have to those technologies, those processes, and those tools, to make work that are in at the same time a very ancient and familiar experience and a completely new and contemporary one. And again, I'm just showing you a lot of examples of that so that you are familiar with the work of some of those people that you may want for your own interest and needs to research further. But it is, this is a calyx crater form that's been reinterpreted by Peter Pincus. And now we're moving on into something quite different, which is the Leach tradition, which was started by Bernard Leach in England at the beginning of the 20th century and throughout the 20th century ongoing to today, looking at medieval pictures to make his work, looking at Asian ceramics, looking at various cultural precedents and reinterpreting them in a very contemporary and way, in a way that made sense for the 20th century at the time. And this was work that was tremendously influential and is still very influential today, mostly because Bernard Leach wrote a book called The Potter's Book, and this was greatly influenced for many people, like Michael Cardew, who was one of his first students, or Ari Davis. Many people went to study with Bernard Leach, read his book, and were influenced by his approach to making pottery and his aesthetics and his philosophy and so on. And he has people following him all over the world, like Gwen Anson Piggott in Australia, through the simplification of those forms and almost sort of a minimalist approach to making pottery shapes and assembling them into small groupings again to create sort of families of works that speak of, again, human experiences in interesting ways. In Vancouver, Tamer Ving would be part of this aesthetic as well. People like Bruce Cochran from Toronto or Warren Mackenzie, who was also a student of Leach in the late 50s, and so on. So Bernard Leach is part of this classical aesthetics, making forms that are referencing historical precedents, and recombining them in original ways, treating the surface with references to abstraction and to modern development in art and so on. And throughout the world, this is happening and going on right now. But this approach to looking at history has interesting precedents in the 20th and 19th century as well. You have here an Asian shape by Charles Fergus Binns on the left, and by George Orr, a form that is much more Greek, made with the combination of three disparate elements combined as one. And other examples of Canadian potters working in that aesthetics, making all kinds of wonderful forms like teapots and so on. So this references to historical precedent is not stifling in any way. It frees them to create new shape, while there is a deep connections with the source. The work that they make is of great originality, and their personality comes through with great potency. Salt glazed wares are also very much part of the classical aesthetic quite often, because salt glaze works best, in my opinion, on rather simple forms that are unadorned and that have a very striking shape. And those are examples of some contemporary makers working with salt glaze to surface their wares, where they have reinterpreted through exaggeration or through simplification. Both extreme are quite often used to make work of great relevancy now. And hopefully you may want to research those people further on. So I have here a selection of classical modernism and contemporary interpretations. Again, more examples of people reworking the classical aesthetics through recombinations of shapes, simplifications. You could say that the forms on the left are informed by Asian ceramics, and the form on the right more by Greek ceramics, by the conflations of two contrasting shapes. And again, by simplifications or by complexifications. Both ways are quite interesting to consider, sometimes even within the same object. And new forms emerge, new expression of personality and originality can be created, while some other people, like Eric Metcalfe, will recreate the Greek Attic pottery shapes exactly as they work, but they will change the surface in a way that is so confrontational and shocking in some ways, with the use of patterns and all kinds of references that disrupt those shapes and make you more aware of what those shapes are, how they operate, and what happens when you change them and recontextualize them in a variety of ways. And again, there are a number of artists who have done that type of work, and those are some examples of that. So you can see that a form from the 18th century BCE, a form that's 4,000 years old, can be reinterpreted by a contemporary artist through multiplication, probably through the making of molds and casting and so on, and then creating all kinds of exciting surfaces on this multiplicity of shapes. And again, the work of Richard Millet, who has investigated those aspects of the relationship between ceramic and history, and historical form, historical surfaces coming from various places, and putting them together in all kinds of ways, questioning flatness versus volume, interior versus exterior. And you can see here on the right by this Likitos by Duris from the 5th century BCE, the source and origin of his investigative work. So Richard Millet is one of the potter who has worked maybe the most with this investigation of those issues around 2D, 3D, form, surface, flatness, volume, inside, outside, image and object, and so on, that can be explored by the use of language, by the use of references to familiar paintings from the Modernist repertoire, by simply removing an image and replacing it by a word, like seduction, or again by making you questioning the position of ceramics in the hierarchy of art forms by combining a pottery shape with a famous painting, and again reinvestigating this dynamic relationship between light on dark, dark on light that I have explained earlier. Or what happens when you mix all kinds of things that are not meant to be together and provide some information but not enough to make sense out of things. And this is some things that Richard Millet has explored over a very impressive career that is still ongoing. And this object on the right is made partly with faux fragments coming from various pretend objects that may be from various times, various cultures, and so on. So that by looking at his work, you ask yourself, what is a pot? What is its history, its genealogy? What does it connect to? How is it experienced? What is its meaning? Why should we be still making pots today, and what happens when we do so? And again, many other makers are also exploring those potentials, and I'm making you aware of quite a few of them here, because it is interesting to consider why, again, so many artists working today are making forms referencing very ancient precedent and recombining them and recontextualizing them in all kinds of ways to create work of great potency. Greg Paste, another Canadian potter, working here with the negative space, the void between vessel forms, to create images within that absence, has made work that is referential of the classical aesthetics, whether it is the Asian aesthetics like we see on the left or the Greek aesthetics as we see on the right, to make work that is questioning all of those things with amazing directness. And all kinds of examples could be included. I could go on and on and on about all of this work. I will just present it to you as possibilities. What happens when somebody approaches it in such a way or in this way, and considering the presentation of the work, its contextualization within the gallery, the use of other material coming into play, and working in Calgary in the 1990s. Working in Calgary in the 1990s, Gary Williams did a very wonderful series of classical aesthetic forms referencing water resources, pollutions, all kinds of experiences, and so on, because the use of those types of vessels and those types of references in a contemporary context create a connections to its history and humanity throughout time that can be quite powerful. And I believe this is the reason why so many artists working today in contemporary ceramic are using the classical aesthetics to make new work of great strength and power and efficiency, and made for all kinds of reasons, sometimes not even in ceramic at all, using foam core, plywood, and papier-mâché. Thomas Satch uses a lot of those references as well, for all kinds of reasons. And I will complete my talk today by a short presentation on sport trophies, where the classical aesthetics is used to speak of continuity, of powerful connections, of authority, of civilization, of beauty in all kinds of ways. And it is quite interesting to consider that a lot of sport trophies given for various championships, whether it is golf or bicycling or many others as well, can either come from the Asian classical aesthetics or the Greek classical aesthetics. And one of the most interesting one is the cricket trophy for Ashes that was started in 1882, and they needed a trophy for the cricket world championship. And somebody found this very small little object in a junk shop on the left. It's an amphora shape. And they decided to just use that little stupid, ordinary, quite dismissive little object as the trophy for the Cricket World Championship, and it is still used to this day, and it is considered to be one of the most precious and extraordinary trophy you can win in the world of sport. And now, of course, they make replica that you can buy as souvenir for just a few dollars. So it is interesting again that within the world of sport, the classical aesthetics plays a very seminal role in creating those deep connections that ceramics can create for new experiences for contemporary society. See you next week.